Hi everyone and good afternoon from Berlin. My name is Oliver Pollakowsky. I'm the co-founder and director of A Path for Europe. First of all, welcome to everyone. Let me introduce PfEU as well as today's topic and speaker to you. PfEU was founded at the beginning of 2020 as a think tank focusing on the future of the European Union. Our team is exclusively comprised of young researchers. We have PhD students, master students, young professionals. We conduct research, develop policy advice, and we want to foster engagement for Europe through our events and also talks as the one today. This web talk is part of an event series called Coffee Conversations COVID-19, in which we want to explore the impact of COVID-19 on a variety of EU policy areas. We have organized 6 different web talks. This is web talk number 5. And in those web talks, experts from Europe and beyond share their thoughts on current policy challenges and how to navigate them. The topic of today's talk is COVID-19 and energy geopolitics. COVID-19 has a growing impact on the global economy. Last week, we have discussed the implications for financial stability, and today we want to discuss the reasons for and also the consequences of the current oil price shock. I'm very honored to welcome our expert today, Wolfgang Sporrer, fellow at the Hertie School. Mr. Sporrer used to head the Human Dimension Department of the OSCE Special Monetary Mission in Kiev, where he also led the civilian aspects of conflict management and facilitated and promoted the dialogue between the opposing sides. Before that, he was the head of the International Oil and Gas Company, OMV's representation in the Caspian region, where he spearheaded the regional efforts to promote the Southern Gas Corridor for the EU. So Mr. Sporrer has both expertise in international security, but also in energy geopolitics. Hello again, Mr. Sporrer. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Mr. Sporrer, I think most people know that the oil price is the result of a geopolitical game, and that it's not only about supply and demand. So let us start at the very beginning. What are the reasons for the current oil price shock, and how did the oil price even go sub-zero partly, and what role does COVID-19 play in all of that?
Well, I think the current situation with the oil price is not a monocausal issue. It is, to put it like that, it is basically the perfect storm that impacts currently on the prices of oil, that impacted particularly 2 or 3 weeks ago. On the one hand, of course, as you said, it's geopolitics. It is certain actors that want to keep the oil price low in order for actors that produce at higher costs are basically pushed out of the market. So in concrete, we have the Russian Federation that produces at a rather low cost. By the way, also Saudi Arabia produces at a very low cost, that really would like to, for actors that produce at a much higher cost, like the United States, but also like Azerbaijan in the south. We're talking only about oil at the moment, yeah? Not about gas, who wants to basically wants to make it not profitable for them to deploy any investments, any more investments in producing oil, and basically want to get rid of competition. So that happened, and then at the same time, what happened is the COVID-19 crisis, with the impact that simply global demand broke down completely in the space of a very few couple of days. So the oil price collapsed completely. So now, how could it go negative? You have to know for that we are talking about, we're not talking about oil that is traded like on this day. We're not talking about I'm selling you oil today and you will get the oil today. We're talking about, in essence, futures. We're talking about, when we're talking about an oil purchase, mostly we're talking about, I'm going to deliver you oil in 15 days, in 20 days, and you will then pay me for this oil. So now also oil needs to be either consumed or needs to be stored. It just doesn't lie around making, producing no cost whatsoever. So if now the following situation is here, I am a buyer. I'm an oil buyer. Yeah, I do not have any further buyer. I'm a refinery, for example, and I can't sell my fuel because nobody wants to buy fuel. At the same time, I have to store oil that I buy, which is expensive, and my storage might be full. And that's a very realistic scenario. That means the buyer will say to the producer, I'm not going to take your oil off your hands because I can't sell it, I can't store it, I can't do anything with it. And then we see who wants the oil less, to put it like this. Who wants to incur these costs of storage less? That will be the one who pays. Maybe the producer, his storages are completely full and he cannot do anything with the oil. It doesn't stay in the ground for technical reasons. So he has to pay a buyer to take his oil in 2 weeks. This is why the oil price could actually go, can actually go negative. Goes for anything, by the way. Goes for grain, milk, anything that we deem very, very valuable, etc. But if the market conditions are unfavorable, there might really be a negative price there.
Okay, and do you think it will develop now? I mean, they have agreed on the OPEC countries, but also Russia and the US, they have agreed to a production cut in an effort to lift the market a bit from this pandemic-driven collapse. Will that be successful?
Well, if I would know whether this is successful, I would be in a very lucky position. I mean, obviously, what has happened in the past is that production cuts. It's a very simple. On the one hand, economic, but also political, let's say, equation. On the one hand, this OPEC plus agreement means that indeed production will be cut in the future. There will be quite a significant production cut. By the way, with Russia taking a huge hit in this production cut, not to forget, they are taking a production cut that they were just rejecting in their negotiations with Saudi Arabia a couple of weeks ago. So that is the kind of economic reasoning behind this. Of course, there is also a political reasoning behind this. It will actually calm and quiet markets if they know that this geopolitical game where certain actors want to push out other actors of the market altogether is in essence over, because the actors have seen that all of them have somehow an interest in the oil market not completely imploding.
Yes, thank you. I understand that.
If I may add one more thing, I mean, you cannot. You also don't need. You also shouldn't look at the oil market as something that's kind of divorced from geopolitics. Of course, at the moment, oil and gas companies, hydrocarbon companies as such, they are seeing a moment where many people are saying this would be the ideal moment to do everything out of hydrocarbons, like all together. So if now oil markets are extremely unstable, if we now have big geopolitical squabbles over oil, this may contribute to a devaluation of hydrocarbons, particularly here of oil, for the global energy mix as such. And that's, I think, what they all want to avoid.
Yes, I think so too. That's also my impression. Getting back a bit to what we said in the beginning, the OPEC Plus agreement, it seems to me a bit that when it comes to energy geopolitics, and ultimately then economic interests, of course, that even countries that, let's say, have tense relations like the US and Russia, US and Venezuela, are actually working together. Why is that? And can we learn anything from those negotiations for negotiations in other policy areas, such as international security, but also in light of the current pandemic, maybe in international response to COVID-19?
Well, I mean, first of all, energy, when you talk about energy geopolitics, it's different whether we're talking about energy geopolitics or about oil geopolitics. The geopolitics of oil are very, very distinct and very much distinctly apart from, for example, from the geopolitics of natural gas. That's a totally different ballgame because of the need for, long-term commitment through pipelines versus oil being a globally traded commodity, et cetera, et cetera. So let's talk about oil geopolitics. I think that what we see here in the oil geopolitics is probably not so different from what we see in other fields of international cooperation. Cooperation or non-cooperation. I would see this very much defined by a very realistically driven, pragmatic, non-ideological foreign policy that or approach to international relations, which in essence is not built upon any idealistic principles, and is very much built upon a classical realist approach of a nation does not have friends, a nation has interests. And we're seeing this very much, and we're seeing this. I mean, you made the comparison to the COVID crisis. I mean, what we're seeing here in terms of diplomacy or the failure of diplomacy is really something that borders on the verge of cynicism. It is where countries where clearly whose medical supply is and medical system is not up to task, is sending airplanes of protective equipment or whatever to other countries for the reasons of so-called humanitarian diplomacy, in order to play for their foreign policy, play for their foreign policy interests and to the populations of other countries. So I think what we're seeing with the oil is very pragmatic. Suddenly it doesn't matter anymore if it's Putin or Trump or Maduro or not Maduro. Trump needs to bail out. Trump needs to keep his unconventional oil producers producing, and he will make a deal with that. That's what we see.
So you don't think there will be any chances to say, okay, we have now those countries somehow finding an agreement on oil, and now we use that a bit on drawing some consequences for other fields? Well,
I mean, first of all, I mean, there is one important thing to be said, and this is that you said countries. I mean, if it is quite it's clear that, for example, Saudi Arabia is an oil company and a country. That's kind of the same. Russia very much is an oil company, is a couple of oil companies and a country. When it comes to other parts of the world, this is not very much. This is really not the case. Exxon or Chevron will not be told by the United States government at the end of the day what to do, unless there is a, some really hard which they are not ready. Shell will not be told by the European Commission or by the Dutch government what to do. Same for BP. So we really need to, when we talk about the geopolitics of energy, we really need to see private companies versus companies that are actually governments, or governments that are actually oil companies.
Would you say it's an advantage of those companies that are more or less state-owned, like in Saudi Arabia? You said that it's de facto, it is a state-owned company, and Saudi Arabia is more or less the producer. Is that an advantage on the global energy market?
It is clearly an advantage. And wait, but I mean, let us think about the European Union here. Why does the European Union not have basically a more independence-minded energy policy? Why is the European Union not playing as a global player in the gas, for example, in the gas field. European Union is the largest import market in the world for natural gas by a long shot. But the European Union is not able to leverage this fact because it's private companies that take the decisions. It's BP, it's Shell, it's Wintershall, it's OMV, it's RWE, it's NG, you name them, and they will not do what the European Commission tells them. They will make competition amongst themselves against the Americans, etc. And that is when we're talking about the geopolitics of energy, clearly an advantage. I mean, clearly a disadvantage for Europe. It's clearly a disadvantage. I mean, there is an advantage to that as well, that despite the fact that we do not have a lot of domestic supplies, our prices are quite low because of the competition. But in terms of geopolitical factors, it's clearly a loser for Europe. Yeah.
Since we already talked now about Europe, is there any way to overcome this disadvantage? The European Union is quite good when it comes to regulating certain markets. Would you say there's any way how we overcome that disadvantage?
Well, it's interesting. It's an interesting dynamics because the European Union has done a lot to liberalize energy markets, electricity and gas in particular. Now, the side product is that now all these liberalized, unbundled companies, when it comes to outside of Europe, are actually in competition with fully vertically integrated companies. So it has created, it always, I mean, it's always weighing advantages and disadvantages. Of course, we have created a transparent market. Of course, we have created a competition with lower prices for the consumers, etc., etc. But when it comes to international competition, all this unbundling and privatization has put them in a disadvantageous position. But this was not, let's say, I want to answer your question when you say, well, can Europe do something I mean, they did this with the policy objective inside to achieve this. So you would have to kind of walk back again, which I believe is difficult.
Yeah, I understand. Getting back or following up on that as well to Europe again, what are the implications for consumers right now in Europe? I mean, they are obviously benefiting from that oil crisis. If I drive my car to the next gas station, it's very cheap at the moment. But are there any other advantages, disadvantages, benefits for consumers? And what is the role of governments within the EU and also the EU as a player as such?
Look, in the short run, obviously, low oil prices for countries that are oil importers are clearly an advantage. I mean, for a country like Germany, for a country like Austria, for a country like France, low oil prices are an economic advantage. When it comes to the long run, when it comes to the, let's say, geopolitical stability of oil exporting countries, when it comes to repercussions on international relations, when it comes to repercussions on certain prices, on export of Europe to these countries affected by low oil prices, it's a different story. So what we have always, I mean, what basically every energy economist is saying, there is something like an ideal oil price, like an oil price that is somehow in balance, does actually exist. And everything that's below that is in the long run hurtful. And everything that's above that is in the low run also hurtful. I mean, when I was working in the oil industry, we had oil at $150 a barrel. Now we are talking about oil at $10 a barrel. So these are really, really huge swings that are not good for the global economy as such, and eventually the global economy as such is affecting also the domestic economies and the domestic economy of the European Union. But but in the short run, for the countries that are oil importers, it's certainly good.
Yeah, exactly.
Like the border closures during COVID-19. The border closures in the short run are a very good means of protection. We in Austria, we have basically people think COVID-19 is over. I think in Germany, this delusion also kind of takes hold a little bit. But that only works in the short run. As long as we don't have a global solution, it's horrible. These border closures will do more harm than good in the long run. I see a parallel there to the super low oil price.
Yeah, very interesting parallel, but it's in fact it's true. There is a parallel. Yeah. I would like to ask you another question. I know that you're currently based in Moscow.
Right.
How's the situation over there, also in regard to energy geopolitics, the current oil crisis? Is that?
By the way, just a question. Is somebody reading the chat conversation? Somebody is.
Yeah, we take care, and we do some Q&A at the end of in around 5 to 10 minutes.
Very good. Okay, please just repeat your question. Yeah.
I wanted to know how the situation is in Russia at the moment, also in regard to the to energy geopolitics, or in particular the oil crisis at the moment.
The situation in Russia is, I was talking before about a perfect storm with regard to the oil price. This perfect storm that we have here is happening, I think, in Russia. I think in what we're seeing in Russia is an economic crisis that is brought about by COVID and by the low oil price, which will transform into a financial crisis, and which could transform into a political crisis. So what I see is that the Russian establishment is, I mean, it's a bit arrogant to say I think they're overwhelmed, but they're certainly exposed to challenges like they have never been exposed to before. Because in the past, in terms of geopolitics, Russia has, also in terms of energy policy, by the way, they have, despite the fact that they've made many mistakes, but they have been very often, ahead of the curve. They were the ones doing the first step, and then they could react. Then the others had to react, and they could follow up. On this one, they are really behind the curve. They are their gamble over the oil price has turned out against them. Putin made a miscalculation there. COVID, they were 3 weeks too late with any measures, and we can see the results now. The economic consequences of COVID are already devastating, already really devastating in Russia, because they do not have such things as Kurzarbeit, short work. They do not have such things as, here, how this worked here. How this worked here, as the president went to the TV and said, now everybody has holidays, fully paid holidays from now on. The companies just have to pay the salaries. Of course, that doesn't work. The companies don't have that money. They don't pay. So that had bad consequences. So there is really a couple of factors that are coming together now in Russia that will make things extremely difficult, if not unstable. And of course, the big question is, what will this mean for geopolitics? A Russia that is significant, that is quite possibly significantly weaker than before. Whether this will go in the direction that they will see no other opportunity than to cooperate more with the European Union or with the West, or it will bring them to the conclusion that they need to be even more assertive on the foreign policy field. I dare not to say at this point in time, but I think if it has ever been extremely worthwhile to look at Russia in minutiae detail, what happens on a daily basis, I think it's now.
Okay, yeah, following up on that, one of our viewers has a question, I think that fits quite into that, well into our topic now. Does a major downturn in energy geopolitics bring Russia and Europe to a showdown? And where does the US play in this?
I would think a energy-related showdown between Russia and Europe is extremely unlikely, if not impossible, simply because of the gas. As I said before, gas geopolitics works completely different from oil geopolitics. And Russia and the European Union are engaged in a basically unbreakable 30-year energy marriage via hundreds of billions of cubic meters of gas that flows into the European Union. So on the energy front, to have a showdown is in my opinion, extremely unlikely, if not impossible. I may add to this that the gas deliveries between Europe and Russia, more precisely from Russia to Europe, have started in 1968 in the time of the Cold War and have never, ever been interrupted except for a couple of days over Ukrainian issues. So usually the geopolitics really have not had such a big impact on the energy relations between Europe and Russia.
And even it's
and the role of the US. I mean, what I'm saying now is a bit kind of obvious, but the US with their shale gas that they produce, I remind you that the US has become from the largest gas importer to the largest gas exporter over the past 10 years, which they really want to sell, and they really want to sell it to Europe. And so the US has a big interest in not having Russia, not keeping Russia in that position that it currently has.
Yes, based on that, we're also seeing the discussion in Europe on Nord Stream 2. Germany.
That's the classic. That's the classic. Nord Stream 2. You can everything. You have the role of Germany, you have the disunited EU. You have the United States, which tries to take advantage of the situation. So this is, I would say, crystallized in the debate over Nord Stream 2.
Yeah, exactly. I would like to move to a couple of questions that I see in the Q&A tab. The first one that I see is, how might energy diplomacy impede the effects of political pressure in the form of sanctions, for example?
How might, I mean, energy diplomacy basically counteracting the effects of other. I mean, that's an interesting question, because it would kind of, it assumes that the same people would have like one kind of policy in the diplomacy in this field, and energy diplomacy is something separate. I would hope that this is not the case, because if your own diplomacy contradicts itself, you're in a not very professional diplomatic position. But of course, I mean, if you want to use energy diplomacy as a tool of your general diplomacy to bolster or to, mitigate a little bit the effect of sanctions, etc., then it absolutely can be used. But yet again, I would be very, very careful not to assume that Europe has control over its energy policy. Europe does not. Companies have control over their own energy policy and with whom they make, which, to elaborate a little bit on this, if companies usually listen, when Europe or a couple of, big European governments would say, well, dear BP, dear Shell, wouldn't it be, beneficial for all of us if this could be done? Happens often. But what companies will not do is, and governments don't understand that, companies will not do something or not do anything if it doesn't bring them sufficient profit. They will not invest in a project for the matter that it's geopolitically important, or that's important for Europe. The bottom line is the money is not geopolitically important.
And Nord Stream 2 being the perfect example for that.
Yeah. I mean, let's look at European energy investments that are done for geopolitical reasons, such as LNG. For example, Poland has said, we want an LNG, liquefied natural gas, terminal. We want this terminal. Please, companies, we offer you whatever, free land and so on. Companies said, no, we're not building that because it's much cheaper to import gas from Russia than to build your LNG terminal. It is only going to be built if the government pays it from taxes. And they did. They said, for us, it's a priority to have that. It's an energy security priority to have that. And they did.
And other companies have the advantage, or states have the advantage, that they own the oil companies. You mentioned that Saudi Arabia, for example. One of our viewers would like to know how you assess the dependency on these industry in states such as Saudi Arabia in light of the COVID-19 crisis. Can this also be a geopolitical disadvantage in times of international crisis?
Oh, well, the dependency of Saudi Arabia on the oil industry is tremendous. It's very big. They are just starting now to, diversify. They have said for a long time, we're going to start to diversify. But Saudi Arabia is completely dependent on oil exports. Very, very much dependent. Same goes for Iran. Iran also used to be very dependent on oil exports, and despite the sanctions, they still export oil. And still dependent on countries like Iran. So I would say the truism of this, it sounds like a truism of this, how much countries will be affected by the low oil prices will very much depend on how dependent they are on the export of oil. And it will summer, very hard. In terms of regional geopolitics, probably it's interesting that many of the players will be hit equally hard there. When you look to Syria, I think that Iran and Saudi Arabia are both very much hit by the double whammy of COVID-19 and the low oil prices at the moment. So we'll see how it plays out there.
Yeah. Poland has a question. She's curious about how the geopolitical tensions in Eastern Mediterranean might be affected by the situation, not just the Israel-Cyprus Euro plans, but also the developments in Libya.
Well, affected by what? By the COVID crisis, or by the low oil prices, or generally at the moment by?
I would assume generally by the geopolitical tensions.
When we look at Libya, sadly, what we are seeing is that despite the appeal by the Secretary General, and despite that the country is affected by COVID, this has had no impact on the fighting in Libya, which goes on, which is even intensified with Haftar basically having declared a separate independent government. So on the Libyan parties itself, I don't see it. What could happen is that the COVID crisis may have an impact on the foreign support that these parties and these armies and militias are actually receiving. So that is a possibility. But other than that, I don't see this. How to put this? the conflict in Banda Aceh was in essence stopped when the tsunami basically, hit Banda Aceh, Aceh province. And people thought, oh my God, there's something so much more horrible going on. So we need to reconcile our differences. I do not think that this will be the case with COVID in Libya. This will not be the case at all, because simply it's not as visible on a daily basis as the tsunami was at the time. The other conflicts in the Eastern Mediterranean. Well, I mean, of course, we have energy-related conflict in the Eastern Mediterranean over the gas fields in the vicinity of Cyprus. Also, that's a little bit on a break. I think that will very much depend on the future of hydrocarbons as such. If COVID brings a real, let's say, hit to the hydrocarbon industry as such, to the use of hydrocarbons as such, then let's say one potential for conflict in the Eastern Mediterranean is actually taken out of the picture. I don't think that's very probable. I think that once this crisis is half over or kind of under control, we will see exactly the same conflicts and rivalries reemerge in Cyprus, both over the central issue as much as over the offshore gas developments.
Mm-hmm. Moving from this conflict to another one, to the Ukraine conflict, do you think that the EU sanctions related to the Minsk agreement might become more effective now when Russia's economy has been hit?
I do not think that at all, because the sanctions are unpleasant and painful for Russia, but the sanctions over the Minsk agreements are in essence sanctions that are prohibiting people from traveling. These are in essence sanctions that prohibit people from traveling. And the sanctions as such do not have, even though unpleasant for Russia, but will not have such a big impact that Russia will completely turn around in what Russia, rightly or wrongly, sees as an absolute key challenge to its security policy. I think one would think that Ukraine, next to the nuclear capability, is the two main pillars of Russian security policy. So over a couple of 100 million of sanctions, I don't think that will have a big impact.
Okay. I see we have still 7 open questions. I just wanted to double check when it comes to your time. You say when you are.
Yeah, that's okay. I took an hour, so yeah.
Okay, then we plan for that. Great. The next question, I'm just moving step by step to the end here. Knowing that Russia has an eye for Montenegro, will Russia use this time now to make a geopolitical move towards the Balkans?
I mean, all of the questions have one thing in common. They're asking me to be an oracle. But I cannot be an oracle, but I can point out to you certain elements that one needs to kind of keep in mind. Number one, Russia is really looking for a landing ground in the Balkans, in former Yugoslavia. Absolutely. One has seen that, and they're doing this successfully. One has seen that now with regard to Serbia, where Russia did very big so-called humanitarian diplomacy, where they really tried to establish themselves friend of Serbia, as an Orthodox brother of Serbia, and the same goes for Montenegro. So they are really playing for the hearts and minds of the people and of the governments, but really for the very obvious and very transparent purpose of establishing a strategic presence in the Balkan region. Montenegro being, of course, very nice because it has access to the sea. but with very mixed success, one has to say, because I mean, TV pictures and polls amongst the people are one thing, but when you come to comparing that with the actuality of assistance and actuality of economic interdependence and actuality of economic and, you know, people-to-people relations, Russia simply has nothing compared to the European Union or even to individual countries of the European Union. So they are really playing not a very I would think not a very hopeful game.
Okay, yeah, that was very interesting, and I agree with you when it comes to the Balkans. I think it's quite likely that they will join the EU, and then it will be interesting to see Russia's influence after they have joined the EU, maybe one day.
Well, I think we have learned one thing. If we've learned one thing from the past couple of years, is that when you're outside the European Union, you need to behave. Otherwise, you cannot get in. When you're inside, you're free to misbehave all you want.
Says Wolfgang Sporrer. Nord Stream 2 is analyzed over the potential increased influence Russia will have over Europe, but couldn't we look at it from a reverse angle and say we have increased influence from Europe, in particular from Germany, over Russia due to Nord Stream 2?
I think you're completely right. I think you're completely right. The issue here is that gas pipelines create a mutual dependency. They always create a mutual dependency. And I would contend that Nord Stream 2 creates at least as high a dependency of Russia on the European Union, on the buyers and the transporters of their gas, than it creates for Germany on Russia as such. So I fully agree with that statement. I think it creates mutual dependencies. This is, of course, why the United States doesn't like it at all, because gas pipelines always bring players closer together.
But why does the European Union doesn't like it then? Germany is still a major player in the European Union as well. But from the European level,
as much as I'm informed, has no position on Nord Stream 2. Zero. You have countries in favor for very clear reasons. When you draw a map, I don't know if there's anybody who has been in my lecture this semester, if we went through this exercise. If you draw a map, the countries where the pipeline goes to and are connected to that are like, yes, that's a great idea. The countries around which the pipeline goes are saying that's against European interest. So it's,
yeah. Now we have a question that relates to Azerbaijan. How do you see the chances of conflict escalation with Armenia? Azerbaijan is highly dependent on its oil and gas revenues and could face domestic turmoil in light of recent COVID and energy price developments.
Mm-hmm. In terms of Azerbaijan, I have three things to say. What we've already seen in Azerbaijan is that Aliyev is using the crisis, the COVID crisis already, for further clampdown on the opposition. What we have seen is that, the opposition or any civil society opposition movements have been under big threat already for the past years, for the past 4 or 5 years. But now the screw will be tightened further. Discontent will grow in Azerbaijan, particularly because the Aliyev regime. I need to take 10 seconds break, dear colleague. Can I have just 10 seconds? Sorry.
Absolutely. So we have a little break. I see that so many of you have answered questions, where more and more questions coming in. We have still 15 minutes to answer those. Feel free to answer more questions. I'm not so sure if we will make it to answer every question. But
I am back. it has just started to rain cats and dogs here in Moscow, so I needed to close the window. That was all. Back to Azerbaijan. So on the one hand, it will be a more clamp down on the opposition and on any opposition movement. Secondly, it will be really bad for the economic future of the population, and therefore increasing discontent very much. Whether it's going to lead to a war with Armenia, I would not think so for the reason, and I hope if any Azerbaijanis are listening now, they will not be cross with me, but having spent so many years in the country, my belief is that the current situation with regard to Nagorno-Karabakh is actually quite convenient. It's convenient for all participants. It is convenient for Armenia, obviously, because it gives Armenia a sense of greatness, of victory, territorial enlargement, etc. But it's also very convenient for Azerbaijan, because every single shortcoming that there is in the country, every problem that there is in the country will be answered with being subject to occupation of a quarter of the territory, 1.1 million IDPs. Therefore, the Aliyev regime would lose a huge part of the narrative that underpins the entire regime, because the entire Aliyev regime is underpinned by narrative 1, Nagorno-Karabakh, narrative 2, oil. So I don't see them engaging in an extremely dangerous war with over Nagorno-Karabakh. Let us not forget that Russia has vowed military support to Armenia if something should happen. Let us not forget that Turkey has vowed military support to Azerbaijan. Let us not forget that Turkey is a member of NATO. So I think that Azerbaijan will not open this particular Pandora's box, but they will further increase their operation at home.
Okay, moving from this conflict a bit back to the economy again. I feel that's again some oracle question, or that asks you to be oracle, but let's see. How bad did COVID-19 affect the stock market? And how do you think it will evolve in the next couple of years, in your opinion? So will it recover right after the pandemic is over, or will this crisis affect the oil sector for a much longer while?
You're managing to ask me. It's difficult. Look, I think for this question, there is no one answer. I think you need to look at certain elements. First of all, I think you really need to look at what type of stock market, what stocks we're talking about. I think that the COVID crisis is certainly going to have a massive impact on a certain kind of stock and a massive impact on another kind of stock. So it will really rebalance the stock market. And the second thing is, I think when we always talk about when the crisis is over. I think it will very much depend on not when it is over, but how is it over? How is it over? Is it over that we can go outside again, and maybe we can even have, classes in person again? But at the same time, you have to be dead afraid when you go to a restaurant with a mask. You have to be afraid when you enter into a plane. You prefer to actually not do anything, only if you really have to. If it goes like this, then we're going to have a huge economic trouble coming ahead. If the crisis, but now comes a little bit of a positive statement by me. If the crisis ends in okay, now it's over. We have a medication, which could happen soon. Medication could happen soon. We have a vaccine. I think then the economy will see a boom of proportions that we have not seen in a long time, because there's a lot of pent up desire to consume. What I, by the way, let me say this here, and I don't want to seem cynical. This is a very a matter of fact statement, what I'm saying now. What we are reading now, what dominates the newspapers, is that so many people have no money. So many people have no money. They have no income. They have no income. These people have no income. These people have no income. What we are not talking about is that a lot of people during this lockdown have earned normally and have basically not spent anything. So there is the downside of this. There is some unspent money that if this ends in a way that it's like really over, that could actually bolster economic development quite a bit.
Nevertheless, do you think we could expect serious consequences on the tenability of the petrodollar system because of this crisis? And are other powers taking advantage of the situation to attempt to price oil in other currencies or even in gold?
Look, this has been discussed so much. I think that the economic stability of the euro has not necessarily, I mean, I don't think that the euro is going to, crumble or anything, but it certainly has not, gained in standing from this. I think that this has rather cemented the system of the petrodollar than questioned it.
Okay, yeah, that was a very clear answer.
Yeah.
Do you, another question from our audience, do you see a prolonged slump in investment in the development of oil and gas fields, or do you think it will be very short in nature?
I think this we cannot say at all yet, because oil and gas investments are long-term things. When you make an oil and gas investment, you look at this oil and gas investment over the next 25, 30, even 40 years. Now, in how far the projections of the next 25, 30, 40 years have changed through the events of the last, 1.5, 2 months is very much in question. But the oil and gas investments, let's say decisions on oil and gas investments, have never been made and will not be made on a whim just because the economy is down or the economy is up and prices are high or prices are low. This is done with a long-term view.
Okay, we have 3 more questions. Let's see, 7 minutes. Maybe we make that. One question: how long can Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf monarchies weather these oil prices before they have serious economic and social problems?
Longer than anybody else, because they produce the oil the cheapest of anybody. Saudi Arabia produces the oil for single digit dollar amounts. So Saudi Arabia has the longest breath, as well as the other producers in the Gulf. They simply have oil that is rather clean and sits under not very deep, under rather easily drillable surface. Other countries are going to have much bigger problems. If you look at Azerbaijan, where they produce offshore very expensively, high technological input. If you look at the North Sea, offshore, everything that's offshore will be very difficult.
Plus, I see that they were actually moving more and more towards China as well, and opening that market for them. So they have an advantage as well.
These kind of oil sheikh kingdoms, they will be, in terms of energy, the last man standing. Stella.
We have 2 more now. One doesn't ask you to be an oracle again, but based on your experience, what are your opinions on the future of the EU, geopolitically speaking?
Of the EU?
Yes.
I think we're really at a crossroads now. We're really at a crossroads now. I think that, the EU as such is nothing more than the combined will of the member states. When you look at the member states at the moment, you have very big differences of opinion. The EU has the lowest popularity it ever had in Italy. They think China is a better friend. There's a poll out there that says the best friends of Italy are China and Russia, and the biggest enemy is Germany. Which is, I mean, when we talk about the COVID response, simply absolutely counterfactual. China sent, you know, a couple of planes with masks and stuff, and Russia sent also insignificant stuff. Germany flew Italian patients out to Italy to be treated. But it's a matter of public perception. I think that how should I put this? I don't want to say a banality, like now it's a crossroads and we have to decide whether we go in this direction or this direction. What the European Union needs to do is they finally need to really work together in policy areas that are popular with the people. And the main policy area that's popular with the people is foreign and security policy. Everybody, vast majorities, even in the most Eurosceptic countries, support more cooperation, united positions, united acting in foreign and security policy. I think that would be an area where the EU really should look at, because the more and more micromanagement inside local, that's not the way to go. So if the European Union wants to make a big leap, further leap to integration, foreign and security policy it is, and that's fine with the people. It's only the politicians of the member states who are against it. So that's really something the people could also push for. Vast majorities, every single state.
I think that were great closing remarks, and considering that the open question we have was actually more or less already answered, I think we keep it like that. And first of all, thank you so much to you, Wolfgang Sporrer, for answering all those questions, my questions, our audience questions. Thank you for attending this.
By the way,
today.
Anybody knows what is my background here? Anybody has an idea? Freddie?
Knows.
What is it, Freddie? I had it in my course. These are the oil fields. These are the first oil fields in the world in Baku, Azerbaijan. These are the old Baku, Azerbaijan oil fields that I chose for my background here. Okay.
And isn't that amazing, sitting in Moscow and having that as a background? Thank you so much.
Okay. Good.
Thank you so much, Wolfgang, for answering all those questions. It was a pleasure talking to you about energy, geopolitics, about COVID-19, about all those conflicts and security interests around the world. Thank you so much for all our viewers, and stay safe and goodbye.